So I'm Elle, I'm an organiser at Tipping Point, and I'm really fortunate that my full-time job is doing our working class organising and wealth redistribution work, and I'm based in Glasgow. And a question that I find really interesting to ask other working class people is, when did you first realise that you were working class? I think that's a much better way of telling someone who you are, rather than listing all of your different economic criteria that make you working class. So for me, I realised I was working class in 2012 in Edinburgh in a little shitty room. And I just moved up from living in a static caravan on the outskirts of Liverpool after leaving a halfway home for homeless teenagers. And I realised that I'd internalised quite a lot of classism from school. And I was encouraged to kind of see myself as being better than the kids who came from similar backgrounds, but had maybe rejected academia and quite rightfully rejected middle class authority. But anyway, I applied for uni, not thinking much of it, had very little context as to what uni was going to be about. And at the time, I really loved mythology. So I took a Greek course, didn't I? Stupid move for a working class person at Edinburgh University. And I showed up to my first tutorial on the first day, surrounded by people who didn't speak like me. They didn't think like me. They didn't dress like me. And they all had this confidence about themselves that I'd literally never seen before. And I couldn't explain back then what I now understand was really violent classism within that institution. But I remember I called my mum that night and I asked her on the phone, "Are we working class?" And she just properly laughed at me. And she told me that, of course, we were. And in the years following that, I stuck at Edinburgh, God knows why. I didn't have the language to describe what I was finding so difficult. But as I started getting involved in student groups and politics, it felt just as profound. It just kind of had a slightly different packaging. And it smelt a bit different, to be honest. But both me and Joe kind of began doing this work more formally after attending workshops that were exploring class. The two of us met after the Glasgow Wealth Redistribution group formed, and I was searching for other groups across the UK that were doing similar work. We've now got this UK-wide network of groups in Leeds, Glasgow, Cambridge, Brighton, Sheffield, and London, where people have attended workshops around class and inheritance and have decided to take this work forward. These groups are very different from the larger NGOs that you might have heard of that are doing wealth redistribution work. The primary difference is that these groups are doing intra-class organising. So what I mean by that is it's working, middle and owning class people coming together in community to redistribute wealth. So in most of these groups, the working class have greater decision-making power, if not sole decision-making power. And part of the process is for those with excess and undeserved wealth to give this up freely and to trust their working class pals to know best how to redistribute this, in order to support the survival of working class communities, but also build hope and power among them. As I said, no, I didn't say, I'm going to say now for the first time, class is really complicated. It is for a lot of people. Working class and middle class are really reductive things that don't really mean much, to be honest, but we're going to carry on using them tonight because we haven't got the time to go into the ins and outs. But for the sake of today, me and Joe are defining working class not only as those who don't own the means of production, which is often branded about in academia, but a class of people who are demonized by the dominant culture of the time, when we're referring to middle class culture, which we'll get into later. We're talking about people who are treated violently by capitalism and assaulted by state apparatus. So what I mean by that is people who've experienced long-term poverty and all the impacts that come from that, including homelessness, mental and physical health deterioration, bad access to healthcare, and state violence via policing, prisons, and social services, just to name a few. And really importantly, when we say class, we're also referring to the multiracial, pan-gender, mass of individuals who make up the entire global pool of precarious labour. And we're also referring to class as an umbrella term, which intersects really heavily with other struggles, like gender, like race, like migration status, just to name a few. So if I put this into context really quick, around half the people in the UK that are living in Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Black households are living under the poverty line. Around a third of disabled people in the UK live in poverty. Women and gender non-conforming people tend to feel the impacts of poverty more sharply and tend to have fewer means of escaping it. We also know that over a quarter of the UK prison population are care leavers. That is mad to me. And that the vast majority of undocumented migrants in the UK rely on really shitty, precarious housing. So it's all completely interrelated. Saying this, me and Joe have intentionally decided tonight to focus solely on class, and there's quite a few important reasons for that. We both feel that class is often really carelessly forgotten in our social and political justice spaces. Sometimes it's forgotten, sometimes it's avoided, sometimes people don't want to discuss it. It's complicated and it's messy. It's often completely missed out of the conversation when other issues like gender and race and migration status, for example, are being mentioned. And we also believe that class in the UK cannot be disentangled from any of the other things we've mentioned. But we also need to acknowledge that both myself and Joe are white British working class people. And there's other people who are way better equipped and more skilled and talented at talking about all of these other intersecting struggles than we are. We would sound like dickheads if we tried to explain a lot of this. So we're not going to try. We are going to send you some resources and some contacts after this training for people who can speak to these different intersections and how they relate to class. But that's not what we're going to try and do tonight. As I said, this is just a 101 introduction. Joe, go ahead, babe.
Oh, Elle, that was mint. That's like one of the only bits we've not sort of gone through together. So that was great. Well done. I didn't really answer the question that you asked because I didn't realize that's what we were doing. I don't think so. Hi, I'm Joe. Elle was laughing at me earlier because I said I wrote in this, I always knew I was working class, which I didn't. But I always knew that I was poor and that there was stuff going on for me that there wasn't for other people. But I didn't have much language for that until I went to this exploring class workshop back in April 2023. I feel like I've got good gaydar, but my class radar is pretty shite. So I was stumbling around for years, wondering why all my mates were sorted and I was drowning. So since that workshop, I've been part of the Wealth Redistribution group in Leeds. Yeah, so that's me. I'm gonna set the scene a little bit for us before we get into things. This session's really the tip of the iceberg when it comes to wealth redistribution, but we've designed it so by the end you'll know enough to get started. To kick it off, I feel like we should probably say that things are getting harder for people who are living in poverty. I'm sure you already know that. But I just wanted to give a couple of examples that's not really statistics, but it's based on people that we know personally right now. So it's just like pulled out of our lives and the connections that we've got. The first one being the council housing estate. We know about people being wrongfully evicted from their council houses en masse, houses that are making their children sick because they're full of mold and damp, but it's better than being homeless. People's benefits are being frozen or cut, and people claiming benefits are under heavy scrutiny. There's been a real rise again in the media calling people on benefits scroungers. And so there's kind of like this dual thing of the way that the state is violent to working class people, but also then the way that society is like violent and how those things interrelate. The only statistic I wanted to bring in is that in the 90 minutes that we're spending together, 15 people die in poverty. And if you're dying in poverty, you're dying of poverty. And that's data from 2022. So we think the real number's probably higher now, given the cost of living crisis and everything else that's gone on in the past couple of years. But we're also seeing, which I think speaks to what's changing, is we're seeing a rise in community care, safety and defence groups. A lot of these groups wouldn't use that language to describe themselves, but that's what they are. These networks have always been about, but they're on the rise at the minute because it's getting harder for people to get by. Don't get us wrong, I think these groups are mint. They're made up of people who need each other to survive, and it's true mutual aid, but they're really under-resourced. It's probably just passing the same 20 quid back and forward, that kind of stuff. So you're the scene from The Dead Goodbye or The Elle wrote, which I think is what's pulled in a lot of people for this, that we've chosen to focus on inheritance today, because in the next 10 to 20 years, we'll be seeing the biggest transfer of wealth handed over. That's because all the baby boomers are dying out and people like yourselves are going to inherit the money. The way we see it, we've got an opportunity to disrupt the way things are going if the people inheriting this wealth choose to get organised alongside the working class, as we've defined it earlier. This means starting to see your inheritance as a collective resource. if you look, I was going to say, I've written it, if you look around at the people attending this session with you, you can't see each other. But what we have noticed and what you should know is there's no billionaires here. You're basically all sort of broadly left-wing people who are interested in social change, who are kind of floating about in the middle classes, somewhere above the poor working class and below like a tech billionaire. We've aimed this training at you like specifically on purpose. And that's because we think there's a problem with seeing the 1% as a problem, or as the problem. When you see the 1% billionaires as the only ones with real wealth or influence, you feel powerless and you don't act. And in reality, anyone who's hanging on to their excess wealth is a part of this problem and can be a part of the solution. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So even if you know that you're not going to inherit anything for another 20 years, we still think there's plenty that you can do, and we're going to get into that. This next section is going to be a bit about the unapologetic working class vibes. That's something else Elle wrote in the bio for this training, that we'd be bringing these unapologetic working class vibes to this session. But what did we mean by that? So I'm going to talk about class and cultural norms for a few minutes. This is really like a quick and dirty intro. To wrap your head around it properly, you'll probably want to do some reflection and do some more reading after this, and there'll be some resources sent out afterwards. Basically, we know that class is more complicated than just about how much money you've got. There's economic and cultural and social elements to it. But we're just going to focus on the cultural for the minute. Middle class culture, that's not just like a personal thing that middle class people have. I'm not going to shit on your hobbies or anything like that. This is like a structural thing. So it's part of the structure of our society in the same way as white supremacy is or heteronormativity is. In our society, the way that the middle classes communicate and the types of knowledge that they use are seen as better. It's seen as a sign of intelligence and superiority to speak and act in middle class ways. Here are just a few, thanks Elle for the slide. Here's just a few of the traits of middle class culture that make doing wealth redistribution work and the working class people who are doing it suffer. So there's perfectionism when it gets in the way of action, individualism, not seeing yourself as part of a wider group, being passive and conflict avoidant, thinking that academic knowledge is the best, being less accepting of other ways of knowing, and prioritizing policies, bureaucracy, and governance structures over people. I find this hard to wrap my head around, so I'll come up with like a little example. So let's imagine like a middle class person who's wanting to redistribute some money. They're like, I've got £20,000. I want it to go towards an issue I really care about. It's a lot of money and this issue is really important to me, so I've got to get it right. I should give that money to a cool organization who's going to use it for some big project. Some of my friends work for this cool organization. We all go to the same anti-capitalist reading group. They've got consultants, reports, a detailed budget, and whoever runs their Twitter's dead funny. They talk all the time about listening to the local community. They must really know what they're doing. Now, if you're from the middle classes, you've been taught this is the right way to be since birth. First, you were conditioned by your family as a child, and then through school, institutions, workplaces, social movement spaces, on and on and on. You're rewarded when you play along, and you're punished if you can't conform. But because you've been taught the rules of the game since birth, you're great at it, so you're rarely fucking it up. You've also got the individual security that comes with your personal or generational wealth, so when you do fuck it up, your punishments aren't as severe. So you might go to a fancy uni, get several degrees, do well in your job interviews. You can make the choice as to whether you want a high-paying job or you want something that pays less money, but it's more fulfilling or meaningful to you, or it's aligned with your politics. And if you lost your job, you'd be able to borrow money from your friends and your family and get a new one pretty quickly. On the other hand, if you're working class, you've been struggling. You weren't socialized the same as a child, so that middle class conditioning didn't start until you went to school. You probably struggle to fit in and face a lot of shame and punishment from your teachers as well as the other kids. And since then, you've been forced to adapt. You've had to change yourself to fit in and avoid punishment when you can, but you still fuck it up more than the others do. And when you don't fit because you've not got money, the punishments are worse. You get excluded from school. You struggle using the right words in job interviews, so you don't get hired for professional jobs. You can't navigate the bureaucracy and forms when you're applying for benefits, housing, whatever. A big part of this, though, is that we all get conditioned, one, to adapt, to fall into line, but also to police other people, to take part in the punishing and rewarding too. And when we do that, we play a role in reinforcing this hierarchy and the violence of the class system. And if you have a lot of power, if you're rich or you have a job or you hold influence or you have connections to powerful people, your punishing people has more power too. And to be honest with you, you're probably not realizing that you're doing it. I've got another example here from that same middle class person with that same 20K. I'm not sure about giving money to this working class group. One of them went to prison, not even for being an activist, and another one uses a drug I'd never take. Their life seems so chaotic, I just think the group won't last. I'm not close friends with any of them, and when we run into each other, the conversation feels awkward. It's not clear to me where all the money goes in their group, but I know they've used some of it for themselves and their friends and family. That's not actually going to change things for people, and I don't trust them to use my money effectively, so I'll just chuck a fiver in. So to try and combat this, there's some traits of working class culture that we're trying to have more of in these spaces and from you. These are people being more important than policy, more collectivity because our community relationships are necessary for our survival, direct language and direct conflict, being able to appreciate different forms of knowledge and expertise, not just books and university, getting shit done, not being afraid to make mistakes or afraid to fail, and being resilient. We basically think that wealth redistribution isn't possible without challenging and upending these cultural norms that are upholding the class system. One reason why the lived experience of working class people is valuable to this work is because working class people are living in resistance to this stuff. We want you to become class traitors to the middle classes and align yourselves with the working class too, in order for us to do this together. So I'm going to pass on to Elle, who's going to grill you all about the homework that you should have done. And we'll go into our breakout groups and have a discussion about it soon.
Thank you, Joe. You were making me laugh then. Right, we've got loads of content left to cover, but we wanted to put the homework in specifically now. And that's because we want you to start thinking about your feelings around this stuff and applying it more to your personal experiences. So, great. So nice one. I hope that was a useful start in place. And I want to repeat, like, big recognition that there are complex and negative and strong and contradictory emotions and feelings that come up in doing this work, and that's okay. It's fine to have those things. I think it's really normal. It's more normal to acknowledge them than to ignore them. I thought it'd be useful to touch on some of the most common things that we hear, me and Joe, from middle and owning class people when they're first starting this work. Want to dispel some of these, or maybe like work on the answers that we give. So the first is, I'm scared of what will happen if I don't have this safety net. It's a really valid concern. And a reminder that we mentioned earlier that class privilege is more than just our finances. People coming from middle and owning class backgrounds will often have access to huge amounts of social and cultural capital too. And it's very easy to turn one form of capital into another. So when you have a critical amount of social and cultural capital, it makes it difficult for you to ever face real precarity, even if you were to lose all of your money. It's likely that many of you have the contacts and the skills and the relationships and the know-how to navigate the world with comfort, even if you did lose your financial security net. So for so many working class people that have limited amounts of social and cultural capital, that means that our safety net is often the welfare state and charity and food banks and the limited financial support of people within our communities. The second one, really common, again, really legit. My parents worked really hard for this. There's kind of a two-pronged answer to this. The first is a more rational one. The second's more emotional. So the rational side of it, the economic environment in the UK has changed really significantly over the last few decades, which means, yeah, it was much easier to accrue wealth through property and right to buy and business ownership and free university education. But that doesn't mean that your parents specifically worked harder or are any more deserved of wealth than working class families who didn't get those same opportunities. The other side of this argument, the more emotional one, is that for loads of people, redistributing wealth can be really emotional. And that's because it often relies on the fact that family members died. And it can feel complex giving away something that they've left for you. It's okay, but try and view this work as doing right by them. So, of course, you might feel attached to the money or the property as an extension of them and their care that they're showing to you. That's really legit. But in redistributing excess wealth, you are extending the care that they are showing to you to communities and others who could benefit even more from this care and are just as deserving of it. It's important that you plan ahead so you're not faced with these decisions when you're in a time of grief. It'll be much harder to do that. And start breaking it down and transforming your relationship with money now ahead of that time. Include your family members in these conversations if you have the opportunity to do that. We've got loads of resources to send you all on how you can have these conversations, and the support among loads of the local wealth redistro groups from other middle and owning class people who've been navigating these feelings for quite a while. The next one that we hear really often is, I've got inheritance coming in the future, but I've not got any money now. Really legit, really common. It's a really common defensive feeling that we come up against. And it's also quite factual for loads of people. They don't expect to see any of their inheritance until a close family member dies. And that might be a really long time in the future. Firstly, having conversations with family ahead of time about inheritance can sometimes mean that you're actually able to unlock some of this wealth now. We see that quite often. People that assume that they're only going to get access to it following a death can actually unlock some of it earlier. And really crucially, it's really important that you start seeing your inherited future wealth as yours now already. And I say that because you are already doing so. You might not just realize that you are. So the job, the sector that you've chosen, the job that you can afford to be in, how long you've spent in education, your decision to have children already or your plans to in the future, how you feel about your debt, the life choices that you make, all of these things are really heavily influenced by the subconscious mental security that you have from knowing that you're likely to inherit wealth in the future. We see in lots of intra-class workshops that working class people can often have higher monthly incomes than their middle and owning class counterparts, which is always really funny. It always makes people look around the room in confusion. And a small sideline here, bit of a tangent, but for this reason, I'll explain why that is in a second. But for this reason, lots of social justice slide and scale ticket policies are a piece of shit. And that's because they don't account for why someone might have to earn more per month and why someone might have the choice and the freedom and the future security to allow them to take on a low paid job. So even if you're not expecting to inherit money for a long time, if you have excess wealth now, you can still begin in smaller ways practicing redistributing your income. In particular, if you own your own home, or you know that you'll be receiving a large sum specifically for a house deposit in the future, which brings me on to the next one, which is my parents will only give me that money for a house, or it's being gate kept for a really specific purpose. Again, this is really common. It's really common that parents feel that they only want to pass wealth on to their children, particularly ones that have a bit of a leftist streak, in the form of a secure place to live, or a house deposit, or a dream, a kind of a life dream, a vehicle, a training course. And it's fine to work with that. Like, all right, if that's how you're going to receive the wealth, there's kind of two options that you've got. The first is you either start having those conversations with family to try and make those conditions go away. The second option, if you're not willing to have those conversations or your family aren't willing to budge on this, is that you go ahead and you do spend that money how your parents have stipulated that it has to be spent. And you think about how you redistribute your other excess financial wealth and how you can convert your social and cultural capital to support others. So if your parents say that the money is solely for a house deposit, how can that asset be used for the good of working class communities? Can it act as a meeting space, a spare rent-free accommodation, for example? There's more than one way to redistribute wealth because, as me and Joe keep saying, class privilege is not just about the money and the financial capital we have, but it's also about the social and cultural capital that we all possess. Equally, I really want to stress with this one, I don't want you to use what I've just said as a free pass to kind of buy yourself a house without thinking critically about this shit. Final one that we hear a lot from people that are feeling quite defensive and a bit emotional. They're like, oh, what? So I'm just supposed to give away everything? And simply put, no, that's absolutely not what we're fucking asking you to do. If you give away everything and end up in poverty, that would be fucking stupid. You're going to end up in a situation where you're relying on the redistributed wealth from others to get by, which is not the dream that we want. I'm not a purist about this shit. I don't have access to any inherited wealth, but if I did, I'd sit with the figure and I'd think through how much feels reasonable to redistribute. I'd consider that I haven't done anything to earn this. It's completely undeserved wealth, and yet I have it. So I'm not going to sadistically make my life intentionally worse off if I have the option not to. We're all aiming to live in a relative level of comfort, not to deprive ourselves for the sake of people that are poorer than us. We're asking all of you to be brave and committed and consistent in your approach to wealth redistribution, but we're not asking you to be daft. Create a budget for your personal finances and commit a certain amount of that to redistribution. And again, there's loads of ways that you can use your cultural and social capital to support others. We'll come on to all of this later, but this is valid and it's an important form of redistribution too. And this, alongside committing to learning more about redistribution and class consciousness and seeing yourselves as class traitors, alongside unlearning and challenging dominant middle class culture, which is also harming poor people, is part of the deal. So on the topic of redistribution, we asked all of you to start conversations to figure out how much you might expect to inherit or how much you already might have. So if all the wealth in the UK was redistributed equally between every single one of us of all ages, every single one of us would receive £275,000. That's a fucking disgusting figure. It's disgusting to reveal while there are people that are dying every single day, every hour in the UK from preventable poverty, and they can't meet their basic needs. The people that are dying of poverty aren't any less deserving of accessing your inherited wealth. But middle class culture has told us that money and morality are really highly linked. Every single person, absolutely regardless of their circumstances, and there's not one circumstance you could list to me where I wouldn't say this, they deserve to live comfortably and safely. And unfortunately, for that to happen, we are going to have to rely on wealth redistribution because we sure as fuck can't rely on any government to do it for us, like least of all a Labour government right now. So we actually tallied up during your breakout groups your collective estimates of inherited wealth. I want you to bear in mind that some of you won't know, some of you won't have done the homework, and loads of you will have massively underestimated the real figure. I'm going to pass over to Joe to reveal what that figure is just now, if that's all right, love.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, this is based on a really rough estimate. And me totting things up in the break. So the number is, and there's about 108 people in this session right now, and about 8 or 9 of them are facilitators, most of them working class facilitators as well, not inheriting much or anything. That number is 140,254,100,000 pounds. So 140 million of inherited wealth is in this room right now.
Can you repeat that number for us, Joe?
140,254,100,000 pounds.
I just want to leave that figure with you all for a few seconds. And when you're ready, Joe, let's carry on.
Okay. So I'm sure you all have a lot of feelings about that. I know I am. We obviously were talking about this, about, you know, the biggest generational wealth handover, and it's not the first time we've talked to people about how much they're expecting to inherit and all this stuff. But that is much higher. It does a lot, I think, to see that on paper. That's much, much higher than any of us were expecting. Like, there's probably another zero on that than what we were expecting. I think that like speaks to how important this is, and how emotional it can feel, I think, for everyone who's doing this work. Like, it's hard for me to hear that number as well. But we're gonna move on, holding that in our minds. We're gonna start to talk and think a bit about what we mean by wealth redistribution. Because hopefully you're starting to think a bit about getting rid of some of your excess wealth. So let's go over some basics of what wealth redistribution is and what it's not. So what it isn't it's not just for millionaires or the 1% bad guys. I will say there's a good handful of people who are going to be millionaires in this room, though. So let's say it's not just for billionaires, you know? It's not charity or philanthropy. It's not just about money. Not to say it's not about money. I think it's important that we keep that. Like, I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable. They find it the hardest to give up money. They'd much rather be like, I'll give up my time, I'll give up my skills, I'll give up some other resource that I've got. And those are important too. I think this is about seeing wealth redistribution as a practice that you're bringing into all areas of your life. So you're not just, there's another thing it's not just about throwing money at people or their problems to relieve your guilt and discomfort. It's an active process that should be taken up kind of in all these different parts of your life. Wealth redistribution shouldn't just be happening inside your circle of friends. I think this is a good place to start, especially if you don't know where else to start. But there are communities that you'll never come into contact with because of the ways class divides us and because of those like class cultural norms that we were talking about, which means that you end up generally surrounded by mostly other people of a similar inheritance and class background to you. Often there's a few little like working class people in amongst them, like Elle or like myself, who've kind of like wound our way into these spaces. But you're not going to be hitting or impacting these working class communities that need these resources the most. Wealth redistribution is not new as well. I think it's important to say that. This isn't something we've just come up with. Sharing resources has been happening in poor communities for forever because it has to. This is just about inviting you to take part in that too. Some bits about what wealth redistribution is. It's something you can do. It's something you should do. There's no strings attached. There should be no judgment, control, or expectation attached to handing over wealth. It shouldn't be, I'll give you this amount of money if you break down for me exactly how you're going to use it, or I'll give you this amount of money, but please can you not spend it on drugs or drink or your rent or whatever. It's not, I'll give you this amount of money, but I'd like to know what you do with it. You know, I'd like to hear a bit back from that, you know. It's trusting poor and working class communities' experience and expertise. These are those like different forms of knowledge that we were talking about. Might not have gone to university, but like 100% knows what they need in their life, what their neighborhood needs. It involves handing over the decision-making power as well as handing over the money. Otherwise, it's charity. If you might as well give it to a charity where they decide. Do you know what I mean? Wealth redistribution is an act of solidarity. You're putting resources directly in the hands of those who need it. And wealth redistribution is about changing your perspective. It's starting to see capital as a collective resource, not something that you hang on to, something you deserve, or a result of hard work. So yeah, I'm going to pass on to Elle for some examples of wealth redistribution that you could do right now.
Thanks, babe. Yeah, trying to move on from that really big number that, to be honest, has kind of choked me up. I'm used to seeing really big figures in this work, but it's always hard. Like it feels like a proper punch in the face, particularly when there are often people with this much wealth that are also in leftist organizing spaces. It's really challenging. It makes me feel really emotional, to be honest. But yeah, trying to focus on like some positives and what we can actually do with this, because the aim of today's training is for all of you to leave knowing that there's at least one concrete step that you can actually take today. And we're going to make sure that you do that. There's no way we can let, how much was it, Joe? 140 million?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't let that leave the room and not have something done with it. So examples of wealth redistribution that you can do right now. The first thing I'm going to tell you to do is to write off the debts owed to you by working class friends and family and comrades, whatever, and tell them explicitly why you're doing this. Take ownership for that reasoning. Don't ask or expect a thank you in return. And there's a resource that we've got for you, which we will send out, which kind of talks you through how to have those chats. We'll include it in the follow-up email. Secondly,
it's in the chat as well.
Thank you, love. Secondly, as Joe says, it's really fucking important to give up the actual wealth. Sure, that is the biggest piece, but we also want you to use your social and cultural capital to take a mental load off of people who are struggling within the system of poverty. It is a fucking system. It's completely preventable. And we want you to do that in thoughtful and practical ways. So this might look like supporting a pal with job applications, might look like disability benefit applications, housing related bureaucracy. And if they're dealing with this shit, get them a takeaway, get them a food shop while you're at it. Also want to recognize that for lots of working class people, including myself, this support is really challenging to accept. And I want you to be aware of that, because you might have to make space for those conversations to be had if people have difficult feelings around it. And that's why it's so important that you frame this as love and support and care, and not as charity, and not as something that you're expecting is going to have some kind of return. Giving to poor people's fundraisers, drop them in the chat, Joe. So we're not just talking about the fundraisers of your mates and those in all your trendy queer community WhatsApp groups. We're not talking about someone who's Instagram famous. We are talking about starting right now with this random list of working class people's fundraisers that we're posting in the chat. These are random fundraisers that me and Joe put together that we don't know any of these people. We just thought they're quite good. They're all fundraisers that maybe haven't achieved their goals, people that aren't likely to get much funding. If any of you have gotten anything from this training tonight, anything at all, if there's nothing else that you do with this content, if you're able to, we want every single one of you to choose one of these fundraisers and send 25 quid to it, or whatever you're able to do. If it's more than 25, great. But that's the homework that we're throwing at you. Next one. Because of the way capitalism and the class system separates us, as Joe said, there's loads of working class and poor communities and people that you will not see and you will not come into contact with. It doesn't mean that they are not there. And this is one of the really key benefits of this intra-class organising that we keep referring to. The working class people in that local wealth redistro group, they do know and they do see these people. They do know how to redistribute it and make sure that money reaches them. You can also set up a direct debit to any one of the 5 established local wealth redistro groups. That's Glasgow, London, Sheffield, Brighton and Leeds, I think. And we'll send you details for doing that if that's something you're interested in. Start redistributing now. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, we kind of encourage you not to think about it being perfect at all. It doesn't have to be. It's never going to be. We're trying to fight capitalism. There's nothing perfect about that. It's not a perfect situation, to be honest. But don't let that control and that fear and that perfectionism get in the way of you supporting the creation of a more equitable world. Like, we all can be doing this right now. And honestly, last one, I'm not messing. If you're really stuck on this and you're like, I don't know what to do with my inherited wealth, Elle and Joe have given me all these examples, but I just don't know what to do. Genuine offer from me and Joe, who are both really lucky to be doing all of this work quite a lot of the time. You can send that money to the 2 of us. Not joking. And that will not go to the 2 of us. It'll be channeled into communities where it is needed. We might also buy ourselves, well, Joe might get a pint, I might get an alcohol-free pint as a reward for doing that work. Moving on from the financial, other examples of redistribution and class solidarity. So we're asking you to do this as well as giving up your money, not instead of. It has to be as well as. So all the following suggestions are things to be done, as I say, as well as giving up your excess wealth, because we really think that without challenging the systems and the culture that allows for poverty in the first place, it's a waste of time. I hope that we've really got that across to you this evening. Number 1, be vigilant of middle-class culture and how it shows up. Resist it where you can, in yourself, in the spaces you're moving through, in your communities. You can do this by identifying it in the first place, by learning more, gaining more class consciousness. We'll send out loads of resources, loads of next steps. Hopefully me and Joe can do more trainings in the future where we explore this. Like, how do you see it? How do you call it out? Second one, bring your pals in. As Joe mentioned, we're usually all part of networks where, give or take a few exceptions, everybody comes from a similar place that we do. Tell them what you're doing and why. Think about what might get them interested in thinking about this work and bring them along with you. This is a bold one that I enjoy doing, but it's not for everyone. I'd encourage you to do it. But you can ask direct questions. When a friend mentions that they've bought a house, when they've mentioned that they've inherited money, that they might refer to as savings, or when they've taken their 4th holiday in a year, it is all right to be bold in questioning where the wealth for this came from. I always say, and I really feel this, if you're under 40 and you've got more than £2,000 in savings, you are not good at saving. You've just got privilege. I really strongly believe that. Or you've been in an accident where a car hit you on the road and you got a compo payout. And if that's the case, I'm really pleased for you. Next one, work out a monthly and annual budget and create a plan to facilitate long-term ongoing redistribution. We've got a real example of one of these budgets that someone in the Leeds group did. We're going to share that with you in the follow-up email. It's even better if you can do that work with other middle and owning class people to kind of hold each other to account. I'm almost done. Get involved in a local wealth redistribution group in your area. And if there's not one, you can set one up. But big important caveat here, we want you to bear in mind that this shouldn't just be a group of wealthy people deciding where to put their own money. That's not what we want. That's just charity. There's loads of ways that you can go about setting up a local wealth redistro group. Hopefully in the future, we could do a training covering some of this. But you can do this by organising a class-based workshop in your local community or your workplace or your housing co-op or your organising group. And we'll share contacts for people who can do those workshops. Also in the follow-up email. This is going to be a fucking mad follow-up email, Joe. I don't know how we're going to do this. And also stay in touch with us. We've got emails for most of you now. If you don't want us to have your email, you can opt out. We promise not to spam you. We'll send you important and interesting emails telling you when we're doing upcoming trainings or ones that other people are delivering on similar content. And maybe in the future, if me and Joe are like, hey, we've got a good idea for future trainings and workshops, we might come to you for funding for this as well. If you think that tonight has been useful, hopefully that's something you might consider giving to in the future. And finally, we'll also share a really fucking long resource list, not only of contacts, but also books, podcasts, films, articles, academic things that are relevant to all of the stuff that we've covered today. Thank you for listening to me chat endlessly there. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah. So I did this a little bit last minute, to be honest with you. I thought it was important after all of this explaining and kind of like, this is what you need to do, you need to do it right now, do it, you know, is like, what actually is the outcome if we do this right, if we like are successful with this, or like even fucking somewhat successful given the amount of money that's available to us just out of this room. Do you know what I mean? And bearing in mind there are loads of people who are going to inherit fucking loads more, the 1% and whatever, who are not bothered about coming to something like this. So yeah, what happens if we do this right? I think there's a few sort of steps here. You know, the middle classes finally recognize the wealth of knowledge and skills and organizing power that's held in working class communities, that's been held in them for generations. They choose to add their own skills and resources to this effort. Money is redistributed in diverse ways. This money can go where traditional funders won't and where charities can't. We can support people who are being fucked by poverty. We can support working class organisers who are already doing so much in their communities with so little. We can support organisations who are working to develop the necessary tools for strong cross-class movements. Then we have the power to create real social change. And like, for me, like, this is the bit that I get excited about. Like, this is the reason why I'm bothering to do this session in the first place. As sort of, you know, I work with like really great people. I love working with Elle. I love working with the like Leeds Redistribution group, and like, it's great, but I'm doing it for this reason, because I see these people in these communities that are like amazing. And it's actually kind of, I think it's one of the things where I was saying, like, we see people that you don't see, but like, I see, it's hard to kind of like explain or put onto paper how amazing it is to see people who just keep fucking going with absolutely nothing, who have like amazing organizing skills, who've never like read anything about it at all. They just like understand people and how to work with people, and how to like create these like generous, messy, and like fucking brilliant communities, and how to hold, like, be the glue that holds those together. Yeah, so yeah, if we can resource all of these things, we can redistribute money in these diverse ways. We've got power to create real social change where we're not relying on the state to just kind of like dribble out little bits of resources for us. So I know this session might have been uncomfortable for some of you, and brought up some like difficult feelings and discomfort and guilt and shame. But to be honest with you, like that's useful for about 30 seconds, if that. I don't really want you to drag it out any longer than that, because if you look ahead at these steps, which I think are like really exciting and positive and like are about building strong relationships and stronger communities across class, we've got loads of good work to do together. So we can't really afford to just kind of fuck about in this space of feeling shit and like, oh, what do I do with all my money? Oh, like, you know, like let's just get past that, because there's so much better ahead, you know? So that's my piece on that.